I'm Dale Marshall with the David Suzuki Foundation. What I'd like to talk about today is just, first of all, what we need to see in Copenhagen, and then talk about a little bit the state of play in terms of the negotiations. Looking at it as a, what the narrative is in terms of, and many of these are myths, and what the reality is in terms of Canada's participation and where the negotiations are. So in terms of what we need to see in Copenhagen, we've been talking for a while, we need to see a fair, ambitious, and binding deal. What fair means, for the most part, is that industrialized countries are putting a significant amount of money on the table to finance action in developing countries, to finance adaptation, and to finance especially the major developing countries curbing their emissions. And I won't go into it more than that because Mark will be dealing with that issue, which is a major component of what we need to see. Ambitious means that industrialized countries need to deeply reduce emissions. And the science is now showing that the upper end or higher of the IPCC range, so greater than 40% emission reductions, are needed by 2020 in order to avoid the 2 degrees and to keep it as far below as possible. And every country, Canada included, has to be within that IPCC indicative range of 25 to 40% reductions. And that's, of course, always below 1990 levels. The fact that the Prime Minister has said that our 3% target won't change very much already is not surprising. We've been holding that position, the Canadian government has held that position for 2.5 years, but frankly, it will have to move if we are going to see an ambitious deal. In terms of binding, we need to see that there will be a legal agreement. We need to see legal language in the final deal. That can mean that there's a political declaration with an annex with legal language. Not the whole treaty will not be there. Not every T will be crossed and not every I will be dotted. However, we need to see that there will be a legal instrument. It will be legally binding. We need to have a timeline for when that will be completed, put to bed. And that has to be in 2010 and hopefully in the first half of 2010. Some of the myths we've been hearing about Copenhagen. The first, of course, is that nothing's going to come out of that, or at best, we're going to see a framework coming out. Other world leaders have made it very clear, in fact, over the last couple of weeks. I think there's been real momentum towards against this idea that we're not going to see anything. The Danish Prime Minister, Rasmussen, made it very clear at the pre-COP meeting that happened a couple weeks ago now. He said, we cannot have half a deal. All the elements have to be there. And he also talked about a fair, ambitious, and binding deal. President Obama, in his bilaterals with China and India, both of those statements that came out of there said we need all the elements in there, which means, of course, the targets and the financing, as well as other important elements like adaptation. Prime Minister Brown has been talking about fast start financing, understanding that that's an important element that has to be on the table. So not only the post-2012 financing, but also the pre-2012 financing. President Sarkozy, this may be the first time I've seen a French president at a Commonwealth meeting, actually went there to try to press Commonwealth leaders, including our Prime Minister, to actually get serious about a Copenhagen deal. The Bali roadmap was a framework. 2 years ago, we had a framework, and we agreed, the world agreed, 192 countries agreed that Copenhagen would be the deadline. And many leaders are pushing for that. Unfortunately, our government is playing down expectations that we're going to get a serious deal with numbers on the table. A second myth is that Canada and the US are doing essentially the same thing, that they're in line with each other in terms of their policies. It's clear that a lot more is happening in the US. I mean, there's actual legislation that's going through Congress. We're seeing a cap and trade deal that's on the cusp of being passed, probably be passed after Christmas in the first few months of 2010. It's clear that in terms of financing, and these numbers have been calculated and put out there before, we're talking about 14-to-1 on a per capita basis financing for renewable energy in the US versus Canada. And then even in terms of the domestic target, the Waxman-Markey bill has an earmark for money to be invested in emission reductions in the developing world. And the World Resources Institute did a calculation and said that when you include those in terms of a domestic target, it means that the US is somewhere between 17 and 23% reduction below 1990. So you compare that to Canada's 3% target. So it's clear that not only in terms of the level of ambition, but the level of urgency in getting this into place, a huge difference between what's happening in Canada and what's happening in the US. A third myth is that developing countries don't want to do anything about climate change. That's been not true for several years now, with China putting into place serious climate change plans, India the same thing, all the major developing countries, in fact. China, in terms of its 5-year plan, 2006 to 2011, had targets for energy efficiency, renewable energy. It has regulations for vehicles that are stronger than pretty much anywhere in the world, including Canada's voluntary standards. Last week, China came forward with an emissions intensity target. India is going to be doing the same soon. So you have, if we don't have a deal in Copenhagen, or if we have a weak deal, it won't be the fault of the major developing countries. It's clear that the ball is in the court of industrialized countries, rich countries from the Western world. A fourth myth is that Kyoto dies in 2012. This, of course, is not true. The world agreed in Montreal and in Bali again that there will be a second phase of the Kyoto Protocol. That's what we're negotiating. We need a second legal instrument in order to take into account the actions developing countries are going to take on. But already the Kyoto Protocol has been agreed that there will be a second phase. What it looks like, of course, remains to be seen. It obviously needs to be amended in order to have a post-2012 period. This is a huge element for developing countries. When you saw China, India, South Africa, and Brazil are going to be coming out with a statement soon that says, here's what we need to see in Copenhagen. There have been media reports about that. I haven't seen it yet. I don't think it's public. But one of the elements is the Kyoto Protocol has to persist because it's the one legal instrument that has legally binding targets for developed countries, which obviously is essential. I'd like to just say a few words about the issue of forestry and emissions from the forestry sector. In the UN talks, this is called LULUCF, and it's hard. A lot of people have trouble following this because of the acronyms that make their way into it. But it's a very important element. What we need to see from any forestry agreement is that the final agreement takes into account what the atmosphere sees. So if emissions from the forestry sector go up, that has to be debited from countries' emissions. And if forestry sector emissions go down, that's the only way that you can get credits. What seems to be in play right now is that countries can set their own baseline. So they can say, we're projecting out and we're seeing that our forestry emissions are going to go up. And so the only way that a country gets a debit is if emissions actually go up more than they're projected to go up. And so and the only way, and of course what happens then is countries could actually get a credit in their forestry sector while the emissions from the forestry sector are going up. Obviously this cannot be part of the system. There are countries that have major forests like the US and Canada and Russia that are pushing for this, and there are also some Nordic countries in the EU that are pushing for this. And that seems to be in play in the European Union, and we have to really look for this because the forestry sector has the possibility of undermining all the other targets if a whole bunch of phantom credits end up into the system. So I'll leave it at that, but I'm willing to answer questions afterwards.